They called him the deadliest prisoner in the United States of America. Not because he carried a weapon inside prison walls, not because he led riots, not because he masterminded violence behind bars, but because of what he carried inside his memory. Because of what he confessed to. Because of the trail of death he left behind, stretching across decades, across cities, across state lines. Take a second to subscribe to True Crime Uncovered. Thank you. Samuel Little, a man who lived in the shadows for most of his life, would become known as the most prolific serial killer in American history. He was soft-spoken. He looked like any other aging man in a wheelchair. But behind his tired eyes was a secret no one could have imagined. More than 90 murders of women, committed over the course of nearly 4 decades. He didn't brag about money. He didn't brag about possessions. What he bragged about was killing. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His beginnings were anything but stable. His mother was a teenager, often described as a woman who turned to sex work to survive. Samuel never truly knew his father. His early years were shaped by instability, poverty, and neglect. As a child, he was shuffled between relatives, spending much of his youth in Lorain, Ohio. Teachers described him as a troublemaker. He struggled in school, had difficulty reading, and quickly found himself in trouble with the law. By his teenage years, Samuel had been arrested for theft and burglary. He had no steady home, no stable upbringing, no structure to anchor him. Instead, he learned how to survive by manipulating, by lying, by stealing, and later by killing. By the 1960s, Samuel Little was drifting across the country. He never stayed in one place for too long. He worked odd jobs, sometimes as a cemetery worker, sometimes as an ambulance attendant, sometimes as a laborer. But with every new city came new crimes. He was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, assault, and even attempted rape. Each time, he slipped through the cracks of the justice system. Police saw him as a drifter, a small-time criminal, not as the predator he truly was. What no one realized at the time was that Samuel Little had already begun his killing spree. His victims were often women on the margins of society. Sex workers, drug users, women living in poverty, women of color. They were people who society too often ignored. And because of that, their disappearances were ignored too. Little had a method. He would meet his victims in bars, on street corners, or in rundown neighborhoods. He would charm them, lure them into his car, and then, once they were alone, he would attack. His chosen method of killing was strangulation. He liked it because it gave him control, because it allowed him to watch the life leave their eyes. He didn't use guns or knives. He didn't leave behind obvious wounds, and that made him harder to catch. Many of his murders were written off as overdoses, accidents, or undetermined causes. The system failed to connect the dots. Samuel Little was arrested over 50 times in his life. He was charged with serious crimes more than once. In 1961, he was sentenced to prison for breaking and entering. In the 1970s, he was accused of murder in Florida. But the jury didn't convict. He was tried for murder again in Mississippi. Once again acquitted. Each time he walked free. Each time he left the courtroom without chains. Each time he went back to the streets. And each time he killed again. By the 1980s and 1990s, Little had become a ghost traveling across the United States. He never stayed long enough to raise suspicion. He left behind no fixed address. He didn't own property. He lived in motels, shelters, and sometimes in his car. His victims were scattered across the map. California, Ohio, Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana. The list went on. Each death looked isolated. Each case looked like another tragedy in a forgotten neighborhood. But together, they formed a tapestry of horror that no one yet saw. It wasn't until 2012 that Samuel Little's crimes finally caught up with him. He was living in a homeless shelter in Kentucky when he was arrested on drug charges. His DNA was taken and entered into a national database. That DNA linked him to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. 3 women, all strangled. Their cases had been cold for decades. Now, investigators had a name. Little was extradited to California and put on trial. In 2014, he was convicted of those 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For most criminals, that would have been the end of the story. Conviction, prison, silence. But for Samuel Little, it was only the beginning of the truth. Behind bars, Little began to talk. Not at first. At first, he was like any other lifer, quiet, reserved, waiting. But then Texas Ranger James Holland came to visit him. Holland had heard rumors that Little had committed other murders. He wanted to know more. And Samuel Little, perhaps craving attention, perhaps seeking a twisted form of legacy, began to open up. He told Holland about murders across the country. Murders no one had connected to him. Murders that had been written off as unsolved. He didn't just talk. He remembered details. Cities, street names, bars, the color of his victims' clothes, the shape of their jewelry, the way their bodies fell. He drew their faces. Sitting in prison, Samuel Little sketched portraits of his victims from memory. Dozens of them, painted in bright colors, haunting and vivid. Each portrait was a woman he said he killed. Investigators began cross-referencing his confessions with cold cases. To their shock, the details matched. The places matched. The timelines matched. By the end, Samuel Little confessed to killing 93 women between 1970 and 2005. The FBI later confirmed at least 50 of those confessions, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. What made Samuel Little so deadly was not just the number of lives he took, but the way his victims were overlooked. Many of the women were sex workers. Many struggled with addiction. Many were women of color living in poverty. When they disappeared, their cases didn't make headlines. When their bodies were found, their deaths were too often written off as accidents. The system didn't give them the same attention it gave others. And Samuel Little knew that. He targeted them because he believed no one would look for them. And for decades, he was right. When Samuel Little appeared in court, there was no anger in his face, no sorrow, no remorse. He looked tired, old, almost harmless. But prosecutors and investigators knew the truth. They called him the deadliest prisoner in the United States because of the scope of his crimes, because of the decades of deception, because of the sheer scale of lives destroyed. Families of victims came forward. Some finally had closure. Others still live with questions. Because even now, not all of his victims have been identified. Not all of their names are known. Samuel Little remained in prison for the rest of his life. In December 2020, he died at the age of 80. He left behind his drawings, his confessions, and a legacy of horror unmatched in American history. Even in his final days, he showed no true remorse. He spoke about his murders with a chilling calm, as though he were describing memories of ordinary events. But his words changed the way investigators look at cold cases. His confessions helped close dozens of unsolved murders. His legacy, as dark as it was, became a reminder of how many victims are overlooked, how many crimes go unnoticed, how many predators slip through the cracks. Samuel Little is remembered not for who he was, but for what he did. He was not a man of wealth, not a man of fame, not a man of power. He was a drifter, a thief, a manipulator, and yet he became the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. His story is a chilling lesson about the failures of the justice system, about the dangers of ignoring the vulnerable, about the evil that can hide in plain sight. Because Samuel Little didn't need headlines. He didn't need fame. He needed only the shadows. And in those shadows, he built his legacy as the deadliest prisoner America has ever known. This is true crime uncovered. Because every case deserves to be told. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the darkness history tried to forget.